Alright, this is the third in a series of 3 recordings for the anterior abdominal wall and various other awesome stuff. And today, this one, we're going to be talking about that various other awesome stuff. So we're going to talk about the last 3 objectives here that are highlighted in orange. Alright, so first is to talk about the 3 branches of the abdominal aorta that supply the GI system. And in order to think about these major arteries, it's important to think about it embryologically. The GI tract embryologically is divided into 3 parts. There's foregut, midgut, and hindgut, and you may have heard those terms before. So it makes sense that there would be 3 major arteries that would supply these 3 different regions. So there's one for each. So the celiac trunk is going to supply the foregut structures, and those structures are listed on the slide. The superior mesenteric artery is supplying the midgut, and it's supplying those structures listed. And then the inferior mesenteric artery is supplying the hindgut structures, and those are listed here. We'll get into more detail about the specific blood vessels that are part of these different major arteries, but just to give, this is just sort of an overview to give you that sense of the blood supply to the GI tract. Alright, the second objective is talking about the autonomic innervation to the GI tract. And so autonomic innervation is sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now these arise from very different sources, and they have, the sympathetic and parasympathetic have opposing functions, but they have some similarities in the sense that they both have presynaptic fibers and postsynaptic fibers that are going to all the same organs. And so it's just that pattern that we're going to get a sense of. So sympathetic, there's 2 sources. The first are those greater, lesser, and least splanchnic nerves, which we talked about in thorax because that's where they arise. Greater, lesser, and least splanchnic nerves, the presynaptic fibers are coming off that sympathetic chain ganglion in the thorax. They're descending into the abdomen, and the fibers are either going to go to a celiac ganglion or the superior mesenteric ganglion. Now, if you remember what ganglia are, that's just the place where the cell bodies of the postsynaptic fibers are found. And so these presynaptic fibers are going to these ganglia and they're synapsing with the postsynaptic fibers. If they're going to the celiac ganglion, they're going to mainly foregut structures. If they're going to the superior mesenteric ganglion, they're going mainly to midgut structures. Now there's a second set of splanchnic nerves called the lumbar splanchnic nerves, and these are coming off of the sympathetic chain, but a little bit lower in the lumbar region, and those splanchnic nerves are crossing over to go to the inferior mesenteric ganglion, where they're going to synapse with postsynaptic fibers to go mainly to hindgut structures. So these ganglia are located in the same region where you're going to find the roots of those 3 blood vessels that we just talked about: celiac, superior mesenteric, and inferior mesenteric artery. Parasympathetic fibers, there's 2 main sources. The first is the vagus, and the vagus arises way up in the midbrain, and the vagus is going to be traveling down, and it's going to supply all the different structures in the foregut and the midgut, everything up to what's called the splenic flexure. Everything after the splenic flexure, or the hindgut structures, are all going to be supplied by parasympathetic fibers that are coming off of nerve roots S2 to S4. So those parasympathetic fibers are going to then connect to postsynaptic parasympathetic fibers, which are actually found on the organ itself. So it's a very short postsynaptic fiber, and then it has its action. So this is another view. Here you can see the greater, lesser, and least splanchnic nerves coming from the thorax, and they're going to go to either the celiac ganglion, which is in red, or just below it, the superior mesenteric ganglion. The lumbar splanchnic nerves, highlighted in blue, are going to come off of the sympathetic chain and go to the inferior mesenteric ganglion, which is the lowest blue circle. That's the general pattern. From there, the postsynaptic fibers will go to each of the respective organs. This is another view. You can see on the right side of this image, you can see the vagus nerve for parasympathetic arising off the brainstem, going to all the different structures of the foregut and midgut, and the and then the parasympathetic innervation from S2, 3, and 4 coming off of the spinal cord and going to the hindgut structures. And then you can see this on the left side of the image, all the sympathetic fibers going to either celiac, superior mesenteric, or inferior mesenteric ganglia. All right, so moving away from the autonomic innervation, going on to the talking a little bit about the esophagus and specifically about the vasculature. The esophagus we talked about in the thorax, but there's a tiny part of the esophagus that actually enters into the abdomen to attach to the stomach, and that's where we're focusing all our attention, right at that blue box in the image here. Arterial supply is really straightforward. There's a left gastric artery, which is coming off the celiac trunk to give supply to that lower distal portion of the esophagus. There's also some esophageal branches that come off the aorta in segments like we talked about in the thorax. So that's the arterial supply. What's more important is the venous drainage to the distal esophagus, because it's coming from there's two major drainage sites. There's the left gastric vein and the esophageal veins. Now these are important because the left gastric vein is draining into what's called the portal venous system, and the portal venous system is responsible for draining the GI tract and emptying it into the liver, where all those things that are absorbed from the GI tract are going to go to the liver to be processed. So that's the portal venous system, a separate system. Then we have the esophageal veins, which are draining into the azygous veins, which is part of the systemic circulation. Different circulation doesn't go to the liver, that's going to the heart. So now you have this connection between the left gastric veins of the portal system and the esophageal veins of the azygous system, the two anastomoses. And that anastomosis is important clinically, and we'll talk about that in class. So understanding this connection between the two is really important. So by way of summary, we talked about the branches off the abdominal aorta supplying the GI tract, autonomic innervation, and a little bit about the vasculature of the esophagus.